If we can speak of the worlding of this genre of landscape painting in the context of imperial power, then its expression by a native elite is at once a re-articulation of imperial visual strategies and perhaps a resistance to them. I'm not quite sure if I agree with that yet, but signifying a kind of hybrid landscape formation, communicating both an imperial gaze and an anti-colonial semiotics. For the colonial artist, the landscape painting is put to use in the reclamation of the nation's spaces through a visual imagery that frames and consumes national fields of vision through the eyes of the native subject rather than the European imperial gaze. But obviously this is a classed and seeing of the internal topography. For Iraqi artists, the meaning of the primitive was multivalent. Yet one clearly articulated aspect of its conceptual appeal was a return to an original state of feeling and seeing. This return could only be accomplished in rural spaces untouched by modernization. Haytham, the artist I mentioned earlier, for example, evoking a childhood spent in rural spaces, describes this journey to the purity of the natural world as, quote, a freeing release that could not be encountered in the confinement that we currently live in, end quote. Jabra writes of the motives of the artists for Society Primitive, quote, in addition to their love for the Iraqi natural environment, they knew enough about English and French culture to be familiar with the European art movements in the previous 100 years, from the Barbizon movement, in which artists returned to realism and to primitive nature, to Impressionism, and the whole string of movements which followed until the start of World War II, end quote. Notably, the artistic starting point cited by Jabra is the Barbizon movement, the mid-19th century French school of painting that rejected the classical academic tradition of romantic and historical landscape to instead paint portraits of nature in open air, including eventually representations of peasants and peasant labor. For Iraqi artists, the inspiration to replicate the impulses and motivations of the Barbizon movement a century later, first in the outskirts of Baghdad, and then in rural villages of northern and southern Iraq, was similarly an attempt to abandon the alienating and confining aspects of urban space in order to fashion the Iraqi landscape and peasant as an independent subject of painting. Jabra writes that one of the motivations of the primitive society was to live, even if only one day a week, a, quote, primitive life. يعيشون عيشة بدائية in Arabic, end quote. Their attention soon turns to the orchards of Jadriya outside Baghdad until this area was swallowed up by the residential expansion of the city, after which they traveled to the mountains of the north and its valleys and waterways during a time when there were not yet any hotels or chalets, end quote. So the experience of living within and communing with primitive nature was not confined to capturing the experience of living in the untouched natural world, but also to observing and representing the inhabitants of the regions of the emerging nation, thought to be the farthest removed from the ascending modern urban national identity of the bourgeois citizen of the state. Initially, these inhabitants to be represented visually were the Yazidis in the Kurdish north. Although the painters of the Society Primitive did not exhibit their art until 1950, the Iraqi government's Directorate General of Antiquities provided opportunities for individual Iraqi artists to display their works. The historian Yusuf Ghanima, at the time the director of Iraqi Antiquities, wrote that one such exhibition in 1943, quote, was a first step toward the formation of a national visual arts collection, with the hopes of eventually establishing a national gallery, end quote. The paintings that were exhibited were largely landscapes and figural representations of villagers and peasants, sometimes depicted in groups and sometimes individual portraiture. Individual portraits including those of sheikhs, I'm going to just go through some of these images, included those of sheikhs, such as Fahd Hassan's painting Mir Aziz Beg, Saleh Beg, and Busur Haj Ahmed. So just to note about the images themselves, as you might guess, the Iraqi archive is very difficult to access, and much of it was destroyed after 2003. So in trying to reconstruct any kind of framework of this archive, I have to rely on very sort of a lot of missing objects, things without titles, and try to sort of guess what some titles are and what they're not. So I know that this series of paintings is from this initial attempt to portray Yazidi villages, largely because I know, for example, that is a Yazidi temple. And I know that the Modern Art Iraq Archive, which is an online archive, locates these images in the 1940s. So you can see the portrayals of the peasants doing sort of their folkloric dances, the landscapes that are being portrayed. You have these images of sheikhs just being represented, Kurdish leaders, and then you have some sort of natural landscape portraiture as well. This is probably the city of Rawanduz, just based on the fact that I know Rawanduz is portrayed a lot. Noting that the exhibit displayed, so back to that exhibit that displayed these images, a combination of landscape and figural paintings. Ghanima observed that a large number of the paintings on display depicted Yazidis from the northern Iraqi district of Sheikh Khan in Iraqi Kurdistan. The settings of these paintings were the Yazidi villages of Rawanduz and Bashika, and included works by Faik Hassan titled A Yazidi Woman, A Girl from Rawanduz, Two Kurds from Rawanduz, A Typical Sheikh, Washing Clothes in Bashika, The Village of Bashika, Spring Festival in Bashika, A Yazidi Boy, Ilyas the Yazidi. Right? The depiction and representation of Yazidis. I don't know if we all know who Yazidis are, but there's just been an attempted genocide of them by ISIS. So it's something in the news, and hopefully they're a minority sect in northern Iraq. The depiction and representation of Yazidis in naturalist and impressionist art functioned as an internal colonial ethnography. At a time of increasing Arab and Iraqi nationalism, the problem of the nation's internal others figured prominently in debates on national identity and unity in the Iraqi public sphere. Yazidis in particular have occupied a notably precarious position within the Iraqi body politic, their religious beliefs and practices mischaracterized and their communities often persecuted. The few available studies on Yazidis have generally tended to view them as a rigid social and cultural entity, ossified by its heterodox religious creed. To a certain extent, this can be considered a reproduction of cliches, which are a legacy of the body of knowledge on the community produced by Western scholars, travelers, journalists in the early 19th and 20th centuries. Historiographical accounts of Yazidis tend to reproduce the notion of an ancient religious sect adhering to obscure and primordial beliefs and practices. Among Iraqi intellectuals in the 1930s, for example, Yazidis were a topic of ethnographic study. The historian Abbas Azawi, the author of one of the most influential studies of Iraqi tribes, also authored a history of Yazidis titled The History of the Yazidis and the Origins of Their Religious Doctrines. The historian Abdurrazak al-Hassani also published several studies of Yazidis perpetuating the erroneous yet persistent ascription of devil worship to their religious practices. So, characterized as a primordial and ossified sect in both Western Orientalist narratives and Arabic historiographies, the Yazidis and their villages were an ideal subject matter for artists seeking to document and experience primitive life in an untouched and unchanging setting. Like colonial landscape painting by Europeans that depicted indigenous peoples deemed outside the stream of history, the Yazidis were understood to be a prehistoric sect existing in nature as they always had, practicing an unintelligible exotic faith. In the context of colonial Iraq, where anti-colonial Arab nationalism had become increasingly prominent in the urban public sphere, the visual encounter with and representation of non-Arab Yazidi peasants, sheikhs, and villages by artists in the early 1940s was an encounter with an internal other who existed outside the discourse of Arab nationalism, yet nevertheless had to be integrated into the nation, into the national community. The visual representation of Yazidi villagers was also situated within broader discourses of the urban-rural divide. The power of this colonial spatial separation made the visual representation of the rural landscape and the peasants function in multiple ways. As an effect of modernization, these representations orchestrated peoples and landscapes into coherent structures of meaning for the viewing subject, evoking a collective primordial past. They implemented new technologies of seeing and domesticating populations outside of the intelligibility of urban identity, and they responded to and enacted visually a textual history that had represented Yazidis as epitomizing the romantic primitivism characteristic of colonial ethnography. Identities external to the logic of colonial modernity could only become legible through constructions of their pre-modern, in this case primitive opposite. The peasant in the countryside represented not only an archive of pre-modern history in the present, but also a path forward towards a modern future. And I'm almost done. I know you guys threw it on too long, but The formation of the primitive society and its return to nature and the landscapes and peasants of rural Iraq occurred as the Iraqi monarchy began establishing museums for the display of the nation's ancient history and its rural heritage. The National Museum of Iraq, established in 1926, was the first national museum established, formed to house the nation's archaeological heritage. In Iraq, the establishment of the museum as an institution devoted to displaying the nation's heritage was intimately tied to the plundering of its archaeological relics by European colonial powers. In the early 1920s, Gertrude Bell became the first British administrator of Iraq, became the first administrator of antiquities in Iraq, formulating the 1924 antiquities legislation that was beneficial to foreign archaeologists and validated the 19th century Western claims to Iraqi heritage. By the 1930s, particularly after Iraq achieved its entry into the League of Nations, rising anti-colonial and nationalist sentiment led to efforts to rewrite colonial legislation on Iraqi antiquities in order to reclaim them from colonial authorities. Magnus Bernhardsson, the historian, terms this period the national phase of Iraqi archaeology, a period of political and cultural negotiation dominated by the British, but still a site of struggle between an ascendant Iraqi nationalism and a British colonial authority over ownership of the nation's past. It is in this period that both the Museum of Arab Antiquities and the Museum of National Costumes, later named the Popular Costume and Folklore Museum, were established in 1937. Eric Davis writes that both the Museum of Arab Antiquities and the Museum of National Costumes reflected a rudimentary attempt to integrate Iraq's diverse ethno-linguistic and confessional groups through representing the country's Arab, Islamic, and folkloric heritage as a unified past. The establishment of a Museum of National Costumes has a particular resonance for our understanding of the social impetus that produced the primitive society and its aim of experiencing primitive life in rural landscapes. The formation of a network of centralized museums, all located in Baghdad and housing expressions of rural and ethnic heritage, signaled the state's efforts to create a narrative of national identity that included Iraq's many ethnic groups. Historians of Iraq have frequently noted its fractious sectarian politics, attributing the cause of much of its turbulent 20th century history to the central government's failure to produce a cohesive narrative of national identity that could subsume the nation's many ethno-linguistic groups within one narrative. In the visual arts of the 1940s, just as in much modernist poetry of the period, representations of peasants and landscapes instead idolized the rural space, portraying it through a primitive romanticism that depicted peasants as though they were living museum objects. The colonial primitivism of the primitive society might thus be understood as the expression of a visual aesthetic of colonial modernity, situated in the consciousness of the urban intelligentsia of the colony, who used the rural space to integrate itself into a global aesthetic culture that critiqued the rationalism of colonial modernity. Perhaps it bears noting that despite the physical journeys of the primitive society to primitive rural spaces, the representations they produced in their paintings were nevertheless part of a rural imaginary that was central to the self-definition of an urban middle class who saw itself as the antithesis of the primitive peasant, even as it romanticized the peasant's purity. The establishment of the primitive society as a movement rooted in the representation of the physical landscape of Iraq thus had multiple impulses. It sought to situate the perspectival representation of the nation's spaces by first framing its natural landscapes, concentrating its physical representation on a two-dimensional canvas. The impetus to return to the experiences and feelings of the primitive self through an immersion in the countryside surrounding Baghdad, and eventually the landscapes and villages of northern Iraq, points also to the pervasiveness and penetration of the colonial discourse of the urban-rural divide into cultural production. The search for the primitive was a precursor to the retrieval of historical heritage and that accompanied the abstract art of the 1950s, so the heritage of classical heritage that I started the talk with. The category of folklore, with its connotations of timelessness, communalism, and cultural continuity, served as a bridge between these decades. The peasant portrayed in the paintings of the primitive society embodied timeless pre-modern origins, culturally and emotionally. Folklore thus embodied not just the antithesis of rationalism, but provided the ingredients for the fashioning of a modern art tradition rooted in a timeless expression of local culture. The search for beginnings through the colonial primitivism of the 1940s, along with the continued and varied iterations of landscape painting, was not abandoned in the 1950s, but joined by abstraction and by representations of newly fashioned or newly resuscitated iterations of heritage, folklore, and the peasant in both rural and urban spaces. So I began this paper with a reading of Jawad Salim's Two Boys Eating Melon, and I suggested that the painting evoked, and I'll just go back to it, that the painting evoked a rural imaginary. As one of his final paintings, we may read it as a culmination of the artistic processes, movements, and influences that I explored in this paper. The intersections of folklore and heritage, the rural imaginary and the primitive. The peasant boys are here situated in a natural landscape, and an awakening to the figurative forms of history and the visual vocabularies of a colonial modernist aesthetic. The artist now had at his disposal, his or her disposal, a range of enmeshed overlapping styles and movements from which to fashion a modern art tradition. Like the visual representations of Yazidi villagers in northern Iraq, this representation of peasant boys is emblematic of the consolidation of the urban middle-class subject's visual consciousness. But unlike the villagers of the romantic landscape paintings, the two boys in this painting are constituted with distorted forms, and they stare directly back at the viewer of the image, returning the gaze of the primitive subject toward the viewer, whose gaze previously had the power of surveillance to observe and order the image of the countryside. The abstract painting, formed through discourses of cultural retrieval and colonial primitivism, thus seems to emphasize its own imaginary construction in the consciousness of the middle-class viewer. And I'm wondering if we can actually complicate this by suggesting that it's almost self-referential in terms of how it's thinking about the peasant. So I will end there. I know I went a little bit long, and I apologize. I'll end there. Thank you very much for listening and for your time. I appreciate it. I would love, this is part of our work in progress, so I would love any suggestions or questions or criticism.